This is the grave of Leftrick Powell. He was the son of the Professor Ptolemy Powell and Betsy Bell, very famous from the Bell witch haunting. And he was killed at the Battle of Franklin in late 1864 during the Civil War. Of course, the whole Bell family and the Powell family were supporters of the Confederacy, and he died, according to family legend, bayoneted by a Yankee soldier. He was brought back here, not too far away from Franklin, and buried on the property that was owned by Professor Powell. And apparently his father is buried right next to him under an unmarked grave. But his story is also fascinating because he factors really highly in the Bell Witch story. So supposedly in this empty spot next to Leftrick Powell is his father, Professor Ptolemy Powell, and his story is one of the strangest in the Bell Witch haunting, especially due to some information that's only come to light in the past few years. Well, to begin with, Professor Powell was grooming John Bell's daughter. She was underage, her name was Betsy, and he was teaching the Bell kids at the local school while courting the girl. Initially, the Bell parents were almost amused that both the professor and the son of another prominent local family, the Gardners, were both courting their young daughter. But in 1821, Betsy broke off her engagement to the professor, claiming that Kate Batts' witch told her to, or that the haunting put too much stress on her. While she was sick, Richard Powell would travel to her farm and care for her, leaving her candies and sweets. They married in 1824, but it seems like Powell had some real skeletons in his closet. What's so unusual about Professor Powell is that he had a previous marriage to a woman 2 decades older than him, something totally unheard of in those days. This was at a time where it was considered totally normal for a teacher to court his middle school students, but he never spoke about this marriage to an older woman, and in fact nobody knew about it. It was only discovered by historians much later, scouring through his personal journals. It's also debatable whether or not he was even a professor. And only a few months after John Bell Sr. passed away, killed supposedly by the witch, Professor Powell's wife, Esther, also died mysteriously. She has no known grave, but Powell was clearly courting the young girl at the time, and he married her only 3 years later. And could it be that he kept a mentally ill old wife locked in his cabin, or that he practiced an odd form of spiritualism with this older woman? There is actually some support for this theory. Now, Kelvin and John Johnson went to visit Professor Powell at the schoolhouse. He wasn't there, so they walked in and saw an old tome, a sort of spiritual book, lying on his desk. He quickly rushed in and grabbed it, mumbling that it wasn't important and that it was probably something in Latin. Now, one of the kids knew Latin and Greek and said that the characters were neither. At another point, Joshua Gardner's brother was walking past the schoolhouse with some Bell kids, and they heard an odd chanting in an unknown language. When they went in, they rapped on the door, and Professor Powell answered. He said, "I must have been talking in my sleep." In any case, he pursued politics for 2 decades after the Bell Witch events, became a sheriff and a representative, and commissioned as a militia captain before dying of what sounds like a wasting disease. And before he died, he had a child with Betsy, Leftrick Powell, who also died in the Confederacy at the Battle of Franklin. He's buried there on the left, and after this, Betsy Bell felt cursed by the land, and she traveled to Mississippi. And another interesting grave is in the back of the cemetery next to my friends, one of the Batts clan. Now, most of these people have no known graves. You've got Betsy Bell's son over here, Leftrick Powell, and apparently the father, Professor Powell, buried next to him. He died in the Civil War, but over here you've actually got a number of Batts. And if you know much about the Bell Witch story, you'll know that apparently it was Kate Batts' familiar that most people considered to be the witch. Kate Batts was kind of a witchy woman in town. She upset the local Red River Baptist Church quite a bit and put a wedge between a lot of members of the community. And it's interesting that they were all buried here. This would have been on Professor Powell's property. And it's really interesting to go back and take a look at the old property records. We just saw an old tobacco truck driving by with a load of, I think it's longleaf tobacco. And buried next to Leftrick here, you've got a couple of Battses. I believe a Captain Jeremiah Batts also died in the Battle of Franklin. But the Batts family continues through the years. You've got a couple of Davis graves over here. Jerry Davis. This is 1865 to 1915. I really do have to come back one day and just interview some family members and get some sort of genealogy and family folklore. We got here to Adams, Tennessee just in time to see some of the smoking of the tobacco, and the land we're at right now, this line of trees follows Sulphur Creek, and it was right along this edge of the creek that was the property of Reverend Sugg Fort, the pastor of the Red River Baptist Church right here in town during the Bell Witch haunting. When questioned about it, he said he believed the witch to be Kate Batts' familiar, and Batts was very well known around town for being an eccentric, oddball woman. So the Reverend formed a committee with Thomas Gunn, another Reverend, John Bell, the owner of the Bell Farm, and James Johnson to investigate the matter. He came from a very prominent family and lived on the eastern side of Sulphur Fork Creek, which is, again, just kind of right down here in this grove of trees. And this is overlooking the tobacco farms. Actually, beautiful, beautiful weather to come out here today. The Fort clan, led by their patriarch, Reverend Sugg Fort, the pastor of the Red River Baptist Church, and the Bell family go way back. Reverend Sugg Fort's father, Elias, and John Bell Sr. had both been members of the Tar River Association, and both families agreed to move out to Tennessee together. So naturally, the Bells and the Forts were very close when they got here. If you begin reading into the history of the families in the area, it becomes obvious that a sort of feud erupted between the Bell family and Reverend Fort's family. See, his older brother, Josiah, and John Bell Sr. were a bit at odds with each other over a property dispute, and the Reverend knew this, so when they were doing communion, he suggested that everybody should be in fellowship before they began. Now, John Bell Sr. misinterpreted that and stormed out of the building. He thought it was a passive-aggressive threat. And from that moment, Josiah, again the Reverend's own brother, formally left his brother's church and brought his wife and kids with him. His wife died either right before or right after they moved, and he likely blamed the stress on John Bell, again putting a bigger wedge between the family. Elias and his brothers are buried elsewhere in town, and their cemeteries are a bit hard to find because, like most people buried from the Bell Witch story, they're on private land, and their tombstones have been gone for decades. The church meeting minutes from this time are actively scratched out, but some public records show a clear property line dispute. In 1818, John Bell was formally excommunicated from the Red River Church, but the Reverend Sugg Fort continued to be good friends with him. The Reverend's brother, Josiah, returned to the church only after John Bell passed away. And by the way, another family that features prominently in this story, friends of the Bells, the Johnson family. They're buried in some prominent graves. David Johnson, 1823 to 1897, Elizabeth Catherine, Samuel M. Johnson from the 1850s, Martha Washington Johnson. These are all people who came after the haunting itself, but the family was here during the Bell Witch events of the early 1800s. We're going to the old Bell Cemetery where John Bell Jr. was originally buried. I think he might still be buried here. His headstone is here. If you look out there, now that we're coming across this little
This is not a road for a car like this.
Not really, but that's the old Bell property. You can see a monument on top of it by their descendants. The river's right over there, and the cemetery is in this grove of trees right here. All right, friends, look at the camera. Well, this is the old Bell property, and they made a new gravestone of John Bell Jr. The story goes that while the witch, Kate Batts' witch, was basically killing his father, he always stood up to it. Everybody else in town would be terrified, but John Bell Jr. always would call her out and say, "I know what you are, and I know that you're Kate Batts' witch." And the witch actually spoke back and said that she respected John Bell Jr. and that he was a very intelligent man. The family lived right over there underneath that modern monument, if I remember this correctly. And this was some of their property. If you look up here, past this grove of trees, I was told this is a home used by some seasonal workers who worked the tobacco fields, kind of very temporary lodging. But this is Johnson Springs Road, the Johnsons being another family that was very close with the Bells. And the Bellwood Cemetery is just through that grove of trees, where a lot of people have been reburied now that they're on private property. I'm more familiar with the old story of the original Bell Witch haunting, but the family legend is that the Bell Witch returned in 1828 for a short period of time, and she actually bade farewell to John Bell Jr., again because she oddly seemed to respect him. And it's from John Bell Jr. that we get the majority of the Bell Witch story, because as he lay dying in 1862, he spent the last 2 days of his life telling the story to his son, Dr. Joel Thomas Bell. He listened and took notes, and later passed that down to his son, Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, who published the story in The Bell Witch, A Mysterious Spirit, a book published in 1934. Now, a lot of people say that these might be hoax conversations that were republished, and that's all a big subject of debate. This whole haunting, this whole poltergeist was hotly debated, still is today. And John Bell Jr. in November of 1828 married Elizabeth Gunn of the Gunn clan. I've already kind of described how the Gunns and the Bells knew each other, because the Reverend had known John Bell's father, and they had both been members of the same Tar Heel Association. I guess that's a religious association of settlers along this river, and around that time they created the home over here.
You can see parts of the brick here.
Oh, right here? Yeah, that's what I was saying. Don't take them.
When they planted around it, you can tell.
Oh yeah, it's been raised up. I guess this is corn, even though most everything around here is tobacco. And by the way, so Leo was just saying that Martin Ingram has been exposed a bit as a fraud for a lot of the story. I think that one of the earlier stories is the Bell family believed it was a burial mound that someone had dug up, and John Bell Sr. said, go put the bones back. But one of the boys had already thrown a jaw piece, the lower jaw, under the floorboard of their cabin. And apparently the witch said, when that happened, a tooth went underneath the cabin, and I've chosen to haunt you. But also the witch, according to the legend, gave like 3 or 4 different versions of why she was there. Another one was just, I'm the descendant of an early white settler and I refuse to tell you who I am. Another one was that she was everything. She was a spirit that lived in the wind and in the trees. A lot of different stories. I think Kate Batts' story is just interesting because it was a woman that was a little bit eccentric in the community. And the property the Bell family owned became known as Bellwood. This is the old Bellwood High School. The Bellwood Cemetery is right over there, across the field. And there's supposedly a little replica. It's been years since I've been here, but this cabin supposedly uses a couple of logs from the original Bell cabin. Most of these cabins are long, long gone, but they say you might have a bit of residual in this cabin. So the sign says this is an exact original, the only surviving structure built by members of the Bell family.
This isn't an exact original. This is the building.
But I've heard from a lot of sources that it is a faithful replica using some of the original materials, and this was the Bell Seniors. We also saw the site of John Bell's son, John Jr. There's still some bricks in the old cornfield.
Yeah.
And this is the old house. Apparently, according to the sign, it was lived in up until the 1960s and continually used as a farmhouse. So I guess I stand corrected. This is probably majority original structure. And again, you can find it most days. The old Bellwood High School is open. It's a nice cafeteria now, Moss's Restaurant, just on the outskirts of Adams, Tennessee, near the Kentucky state line. The Bell family descendants are still here. You can see they have some beef farms. This is the City Hall. Over here is the Bell Hollow, or the Bellwood Cemetery. And it's all in the shadow of Moss's Restaurant, the old Bell Hollow High School.